chat feature. Our hosts will monitor chats throughout the session and pose questions to the panelists during Q&A. On behalf of the SAAL Professional Development Committee, I want to say thanks to our presenters. SAAL is committed to involving, featuring, and representing diverse perspectives and identities in our professional development offerings. And we ultimately want to meet your professional development needs. So now it's my pleasure to get started with today's conversation, building an integrated data system for student affairs data. The panelists will discuss their journey building an integrated data system of student affairs at their institutions and the process for building an integrated data system of student affairs data, which can vary depending on institutional differences, including resources, strategic goals, and leadership support. To introduce today's panelists, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Alyssa Brooks Nelson, who currently serves as the Divisional Director for Student Affairs Research and Assessment at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She has over 15 years of experience in program evaluation, assessment, strategic planning, data management, and educational research. Alyssa's held leadership positions within local government, higher and secondary education, and the nonprofit sectors. Annie Carlson Welch serves as an assistant to the Vice President for Student Affairs at the University of Georgia. In her role, Annie oversees strategic planning, academic partnerships, learning and improvement, and accreditation. Dr. Adam Cebulski is the founder and CEO of Transform Forward. He is an innovative and data-driven strategic executive focused on continual improvement to accelerate personal and organizational growth. Adam Polipshin is an expert in educational data mining, learning analytics, psychometrics, and applied research. He's currently the Assistant Director of Assessment, Evaluation, and Research in the Division of Student Affairs at Stony Brook University. And Dr. Scott Radimer is the Director of Assessment and Planning at the University of Houston and is a member of the NASPA Assessment, Evaluation, and Research Knowledge Community Leadership Team. He has over 6 years of professional experience in assessment and 16 years in higher ed, including serving as an adjunct faculty member in higher education at the University of Memphis. Again, I want to extend a very warm welcome to our panelists and thank them for sharing their expertise with us today. So to begin with our first question, and this is a question that I will pose to all members of our panel. Please discuss how your institution initiated the idea for building an integrated data system. Who are the key stakeholders in moving the initiative forward? How have you leveraged relationships to move your integrated data system forward?
Well, I might as well go first. So I work inside student affairs in a specific area with a moniker called CRAFT, which stands for Communication, Research, Assessment, Fundraising, and Technology. And because of the work that we do for the division, we're sitting on top of or have access to a lot of data. And luckily, leadership sees value in the work that we do. So anything that can make the process more efficient is usually well received. Luckily, the individual that I report to, whose title is Executive Director of Strategic Analytics and Technologies, not only has immense technical and analytical skills, he's also highly trusted by our VP of Student Affairs and has strong relationship with the Associate VP for IR. So when I mentioned that I would like to explore the development of student affairs data storage system, he immediately knew its value, its feasibility, and how it would be received by the division. So in this regards, I'm, very lucky. All the stakeholders are on board, and we're all interested in moving the initiative further. So unlike others, we've met no resistance whatsoever, and it's a priority for the division.
So I'm actually just leaving my role at SMU in Dallas, Texas, where I served as the Chief of Staff and Assistant Vice President for Student Engagement and Success. I've been there for 7 years, and when I started there, the institution had the idea that they wanted to form a data warehouse, data lakes, and they offered the university the opportunity to submit projects. For Division of Student Affairs, we had seen a 315% increase in substance abuse related issues, both at the conduct level as well as the case management level. This was pretty alarming. Prior to that, we had several student deaths in the past related to substance abuse, and we really wanted to understand more about these students. But this was taking multiple people, multiple weeks, pulling together imports and exports from various systems that we had to do statistical combinations by hand. And at that point, they were immediately out of date. So our project was the one that was selected to initiate the data warehouse and data governance project on campus, really focused on understanding the students who were either getting in trouble or experiencing issues related to substance abuse and particularly risky behavior. And I think for us, because this was such an important part of the student experience and something that we didn't want to have any, God forbid, deaths or severe incidents from, the university was fully behind it, and it supported it as its first project to inception. I think we learned a lot about our sort of lack of ability to do a data warehouse at that point. But in terms of the actual getting people on board, everyone was on board, everywhere from academic partners who wanted to make sure that our students were safe and healthy, to institutional research who was actually going to be working with data that they had never had access to, because we were talking about student engagement data or the rec center data, sort of not the typical reporting data that the university would use. And so we started that project about 6.5 years ago. And that was the first one that the university had embarked on from a big data perspective.
I'll go next. So for us, we were pretty lucky, similar to Adam, that we had leadership support from the very beginning. So our current vice chancellor, he had been at UNC Charlotte for about a year when he started talking about, we've got all this data, we need to be able to tell our story. But the way the data was so siloed at the time, we weren't able to access it in a way where we could tell our story. And we actually went through a number of iterations of trying to gather our data, which I'll talk about more later on. But we had several fails before we finally got to what's working for us at this point. And so, from a leadership perspective, we have had support from the top down. But what we really needed to do was connect with our IT folks. Because we knew this wasn't something that we could do alone by ourselves in student affairs. So that's really been the most integral piece to our success so far. I made a point to do regular one-on-ones with our chief data officer for One IT, and that has really helped move things along in building our integrated data system.
At the University of Georgia, I would say generally there was a bit of apathy at the time when we decided to start this project. Our institutional research office had already started creating a data warehouse. And so we took it as an opportunity to jump in and say, can we actually give you more data to toss in there? And honestly, it was more just like, sure, but we don't really care what data you have. But we did in student affairs. We cared about our data, and it was very challenging to see, just like Alyssa said, all the different siloed data pieces and not being able to read one another and come together. So we did work with our IR folks as well, just like everyone else is talking about, had a great partnership there, and we continue to. And we started working on this project in 2016. and I've come quite a long way, lots of learning lessons throughout. But it's been a great opportunity to kind of connect all those pieces together and figure out, so how do we tell our story? That part for sure. Also, how do we prove that what we're doing in our strategic plan is working? When we set out all of our parameters and things that were, included all these numbers that we needed to measure and say, yes, it is, we're doing what we said we were going to do. We needed that part as well. So there's a little bit of wanting to prove that we are doing what we say we're doing, a little bit of look at all this engagement information, look how great students doing. And we're now in a place of trying to figure out, much like Adam said, how do we bring these pieces together to figure out where are the students that are falling through the cracks, and how do we use this data to identify students in need?
So at the University of Houston, I started here in summer of 2019. And when I got here, the institution was already, the division and the institution were already ready to start having this conversation. Our president is very data driven. She expects people who report to her to have data. And so our departments had been collecting data for a long time, but it has all been in like an Excel spreadsheets, really, and sending lists of student IDs and tracking those kind of things. The departments have been tracking information for a long time in different platforms for students who engage with them in different ways. So they already had lists of students who are participating, but then that's all manually getting sent to my office. I've been in a similar position before Houston at the University of Memphis, where they already had student activity codes that were being recorded in Banner there in the record system. And so when I came over here, I was like, well, why don't we have this? We should start collecting all this information in one place so there's better records and you can track across areas rather than just focusing on one department at a time. And people were very on board with that. And so the champions really were my AVP was a big supporter of that. And then institutional research was very excited to have this. They'd been wanting this data. So for someone to take the lead and help make that happen, they're very on board with that. And then at the time, our registrar's office and the campus solutions office, which manages PeopleSoft, our system of record at the University of Houston, we're all part of the division. And so it's very easy to have all the important people who needed to sign off on this in one room. Obviously, COVID hit and this took a back seat. And so we've been able to now kind of get back on board and start doing our, I guess, beta launch of the process, and we'll be expanding it. But I couldn't have done it without the championing from my AVP, who's now our interim vice president, institutional research being very much on board, and then the registrar's office and the campus solutions office helping with that infrastructure. And I think it probably helped that because of my prior experiences managing this, that they felt like they were working with someone who understood what the concerns were of who should have access to this data, how is it being collected, who's inputting it, and those kind of things, so that we're not creating privacy concerns or violating student record, good management practices, those kinds of things.
Fantastic. Thank you all for your thoughts on that opening question. This next question, I'd like to direct specifically to Adam Cebulski and to Annie. How are you using your integrated data system to inform data analysis and or visualization to generate actionable insights?
So we probably use our visualizations more from a business operations perspective than a peer reporting perspective. So a really good example is for a lot of our student leadership positions, for instance, we will have GPA requirements, conduct requirements, or they have to have reached a certain level of involvement on campus. We're able to utilize Tableau to input those student IDs to let us know whether or not students are eligible for these different things, because it's going to query against all that other data that we have. So we can do an easy plug and play of here's the students who apply to these roles, and then it's going to tell us yes, yes, no, and for what reasons they're ineligible. We also have it where we are building sort of a one profile for students. so that when they are doing both their engagement, we use Anthology and are switching to campus groups. When they check in at the rec center, when they take Nessie, or when they do the MSL, it's going to bring it all together. So if somebody's going to be meeting with that individual, they have a bigger picture of what's going on for them. It combines their scholar ratings, their financial aid package, whether or not they have a FERPA release to their parents. So when an advisor or a counselor is going to meet with those individuals, they have a better snapshot of who they are, what's going on in their life, and how we can make some more targeted decision-making around how we might engage with those students. Post-COVID, we use these really heavily to track our sophomores, those students who didn't have a normal first year on campus because of COVID. We tracked them and used these dashboards throughout their entire first year to strategically engage them in conversations, and then keep track of the reporting post-conversation to see where there was follow-up needed, whether it was through our case management team, financial aid, academic resources. So we really use them to help us target and be more intentional about the ways that we engage our students. We have lots of things that just do purely descriptive, and they're pretty dashboards for a board of trustees or for general reporting. But I would say that the value that we've really gotten out of it is really from that operations standpoint, and how do we turn data into action for us?
So this was one of our, I guess, midway through our project so far, learning lessons, because we tried to start off by creating a one-size-fits-all data analysis system. So we also use Tableau, and we tried to create a bajillion dashboards that were basically generalizable dashboards that any of our directors for our departments could log in and look at data that we had collected on engagement opportunities. And the reality was, like, none of our directors knew how to pull that information. I mean, even if I think Tableau is actually pretty user-friendly, and that's not to say our directors are not intelligent humans. It is to say, what did it mean to them was the question we kind of came back to. It didn't speak to them individually at all. So we've actually spent the past year and a half, we've ditched all of those initial dashboards we created, like literally threw them in the garbage and started again by going department to department and saying, what do you need in this department? What data is important for you all? And how do we create visual guidance for you that will shape that data? So in one instance, our Student Veterans Resource Center, they don't need pretty dashboards, but they do need one enormous list of students with lots and lots of information on each of those students, and they need to know when they're coming and going, so they need to know lots of change in events. So it's not the prettiest thing that they have, but it's highly effective. And what it's resulted in is the way in which we were pulling information and connecting dots that hadn't been connected before meant they went from serving maybe 200 to 250 students a year to 600 in 1 year's time. So they have had a significant shift in who they serve and how they serve them, because we just shifted how we were giving them data. On a totally opposite end, we have our Office of Greek Life, that they need a lot of grade data, and they need membership roster data and stuff that we use Anthology as well, and stuff that we probably could pull from there, but that's not part of the system that we have purchased. And so we do it in Tableau instead and give them the exact data that they're needing. And then on my end, because those big dashboards were actually really helpful for me from a division-wide standpoint, I have my own dashboard that is all related to our strategic plan and measures over time, shows trend data that allows us to see how we're doing on our strategic plan. So we have learned that over time, that we actually need to target in on exactly who needs what data and why. And then that also allows us to more appropriately provide data to them and not provide data people don't need as well.
I really appreciate those responses. I've built some of my own dashboards, and when you have access to all this information, it's tempting to create a visual for everything. Staying in communication with partners and really thinking about the use, that's wonderful. I have two more questions prepared for our panelists. Please, everyone, continue to think about questions that you have and share those questions in the chat so we can get to them during our Q&A. This next question I'll pose to Scott first before asking our other panelists to chime in. What have been your most significant challenges in developing an integrated data system? How have you overcome these challenges?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest challenge in building the system here at the University of Houston is just trying to think through how it's going to work and trying to think about as much as possible how to future-proof the system that you design. When I was at Memphis, I had inherited a system that had been set up with kind of a clear logic about we have these codes, we have these naming structures, here's when and how they're inputted. And then as leadership turned over, directors were getting to a place where they wanted to create and remove codes like semesterly. And that's a nightmare from a data perspective, because you shouldn't be adding records to Banner, and for one semester and then dropping them, or like every time a program changes its name, you can't change the code or create a new code, because then you can't track anything historically. It doesn't mean anything. You're just kind of polluting the student records with unnecessary information. So figuring out like who's going to manage this process, what is a sustainable process that should exist once the individuals who created this are gone. For that, how is the data going to be used? So we decided to have retrospective data, not active data. So rather than trying to manage, here's the roster of active Greek members this semester, and then it changes on, the next day as people come and go. We wait until the end of the semester to pull those records, send them to me, I'll input them, and then we know for the semester before, here's who was a member. So it's much more historical for that, because there's not the people power, in case the Scott power, to be able to continuously update that, because that's the only thing that I would be doing. And so this is really for looking at like participation data, correlations between involvement, retention, graduation, and being able to combine these records across the division. So right now we can tell departmental or program stories, but we really can't talk about the impact that our division has on students and engagement across the division. And so as we build out these codes, hopefully we'll be able to talk much more about the aggregate impact that our division and multiple departments have on students, but figuring out like who's going to manage it. What's the process? Do you have a naming scheme that's going to last past the creation of it? So we're using student group codes in PeopleSoft, which can only have 4 digits for that. So we're using, numbers. Each department has a number assigned to it, and then the program would have the last 2 digits for that, and how you're going to query those records. The most important thing that most people are going to run into, which I think are things that the panel all talked about before, is really the buy-in is probably the most important part. So because I've been fortunate enough to come into a place that already had the buy-in, I've been able to run with that. And so my focus has been much more technical. But in terms of building buy-in, it's certainly very important, to talk about like what Annie was talking about, right? How is this going to make people's lives better? How is this going to give them the information that they need to succeed? Because I think we all probably experienced one point or another people feeling like the assessment process is something that gets in the way of them doing their job, that it's busy work that they don't want to do, right? But actually it's very vital to them doing their job more effectively, and that if they take a little bit of time to be thoughtful about it, they can get a whole lot more time back and get a lot more return on their efforts. So I think helping people understand how like we're helping them do their jobs and helping make their lives easier is probably, I would say, the most important part. If you need to build that buy-in, if it's not already there, you don't already have that champion to help clear the way and get people on board for you.
Sure, I can go next. Since we're in our early stages, most of our challenges have been related to data engineering. For example, I've spent a significant amount of time just getting comfortable with the affordances and limitations of the various APIs I need to use to extract data from various sources. if the term API is a little bit alien, it just stands for Application Programming Interface, and just refers to some software that we use to send information back and forth between the website or app and the user. But in my opinion, getting comfortable with the data and how it could be relevant is super important. Without knowing your data, you won't be able to understand what dimensions you can actually operationalize. But I foresee our next hurdles are going to be centered around like what technology we ultimately use to store the data, which is also deeply entwined with conversations about data governance issues, as the safety of student data is, we could all agree, paramount. For example, should data be de-identified? Who should have access to what? Should data that was entrusted to us from one area of student affairs be accessible to another? Should certain data related to minoritized communities be completely off limits? But lucky for me, these decisions are a bit above my pay grade. But nonetheless, these are important conversations that we're going to have in the near future. But we're not there yet. Thanks.
I'll go next. So for us, we're in the pilot phase of building our data lake. And our biggest challenge really was, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do it right? And how are we going to do it successfully? Because we'd attempted this in the past several times. The problem is, in previous attempts, kind of the approach was, let's just gather all the data that we can in student affairs and do something with it. But there was no intentionality around why we're doing it, how we're going to use that data, what outcomes we're really focused on. And so it failed every single time because we couldn't get buy-in from staff. And at the end of the day, while we need IT, we need leadership to support this, we also need staff to be bought in and to support it in order for it to be successful. So what we did is we were like, how can we do this with intention? What is our outcome? So for us, we're really focused on retention. And so for our pilot phase, we're really focused on programs, initiatives, services within the division, where there's that intentionality around student engagement. And the big hot topic right now is sense of belonging. So we were like, let's start small. Let's start there with those intentionality around student engagement, programming, initiatives, and services, and then build our data lake. And then we can continue to expand out our data lake from there. So we are nearing the end of our pilot phase for our 1-year pilot. And so far, so good. I'll say one of the biggest challenges is spreadsheets. My team has had to reformat, restructure, clean up spreadsheets at every data collection that we do. And so what we've done is we've created student affairs census dates that are in alignment with the institutional census date. Just generally, whenever we're collecting our data, it's about a semester behind. But basically, we're dealing with spreadsheets so much, we were like, we have to come up with a standard data collection protocol because our team, we can deal with it short term, but this is not a long-term solution. So basically what we've done is we've identified a platform, Anthology Engage, that we'll use for any departments that are currently using spreadsheet to collect student participation information. So essentially what we're focused on right now is rosters, and we're transitioning them into using Engage. And so we're doing that department by department, coming up with a transition plan. Another issue we had was, once we do have all this data in the data lake, I know what my team wants to do with that data. We want to do predictive analytics. We want to do more robust data analytics, really at a divisional level. But what do our departments need? What do they want? How can we help them when we have this data in a different, accessible way that they've never seen before? So we did have individual one-on-one meetings with each department participating in the pilot to ask them, what is it that you're regularly reporting out on? Because we knew we could turn that into a data view. But also, what story do you want to tell? If you could tell this story today about your program or your service initiative, what is it that you would want to tell leadership? And so we're taking that information to help us figure out what data views we can build with the data we have right now in the data lake. So those are different ways that we've had those challenges, but we've also found solutions to those challenges. And I'll also mention too that we only have 2 IT folks helping build the data lake for us. That's been another challenge. It is what it is. We've had, life happens. So we've had a little slower progression as we would have liked, just because of personal life situations that have happened with those IT folks that have been helping us. But at the end of the day, I'm really amazed by how fast they've been able to work with little resources that they have.
I'll add to Adam's point on a challenge for maybe it's me is the data that we're missing, and that always becomes a limitation. So when I talk to our division about what kind of data we have, it's that we have positive participation data. So we don't include anything that is around student judicial records. And then of course, we don't include anything from our health center because those are HIPAA protected. And so that is not data we're permitted to bring into our data warehouse. And then in addition to that, our Disability Resource Center is like HIPAA-ish. So most of that data does not come in. And the other piece that we do not collect data on at the University of Georgia is the Pride Center. So we do not collect any participation students that attend events at our Pride Center. We do not want to be responsible for labeling any student as having attended an event that could jeopardize that student in any way. And because that data on engagement is not FERPA protected, we can be required to provide that information to whoever might ask for it. And so we are very cautious as to what type of data we include, just looking at, as Adam said, student safety and what is a responsible use of privacy. We have a really extensive data stewardship model at UGA. That means you as a department head basically own any data that comes to you that you collect within your department. And so we have to have a lot of partnerships with a lot of data stewards to say, can we have access to this information? So we have that kind of within our division, but any access to data outside of our division that is owned elsewhere, and most of that is owned by the registrar. Some of it's owned by admissions, some of it's owned by our Office of Diversity. We have to go make partnerships with and ask for it, but we do so in a way of making sure we're not going to jeopardize a student and their identities in any way.
I think the other big hurdle that I'll offer is that it's always going to take longer than you think it will, right? Whether it's the availability of IT resources, the cleaning up of the data, you can plan as best as you can, but it always is going to seem like it's taking longer than you were thinking it would or hoping it would.
Wonderful. Well, I see that the questions are rolling in the chat. So this is the last question that we prepared for the panelists before we open it up to general Q&A. What tips, advice, insights could you share for folks that may be just starting to think about developing an integrated system of student affairs data at their institutions?
I think the biggest thing for me that I would recommend is focus less on this big, just massive pile of data and focus more on the question that you're trying to answer, right? Think about it. And this could be me from having taught research methods and stats. What is that research question that you're trying to answer? And then start with the data that's just affiliated with that. When we did our planning process, we used a STAR schema method, which is based on an event and dimensions associated with that event. If you don't know it, I highly encourage you to check it out, STAR schema. But then you can build on that later, right? Your next question may use some of that data and then some more data, and you start to integrate more. Don't think about it as an all at once kind of deal. It's meant to be iterative. It's meant to grow on itself, and you should be contributing more over time. And don't worry about having everything in there all at once, because we all ran into problems with that. Like you've heard that it's overwhelming. You kind of think about questions or responding to dashboards in the wrong kind of way. It's not as helpful, or somebody may just be doing some exploratory stuff, which may not be as intentional as somebody who has a direct question they're trying to answer. So I really say, think about it from the question you're trying to answer, and it's okay to start small and take off chunks around the edge before you start to move in toward the center. And it's not every platform, every data source all at once. It's as you need them and as you get these questions integrated and you find that your dashboard or your repository or data lake is working well.
I would have to totally agree. Voltaire said something like, don't make the best the enemy of good. So, just start. even if it's just the creation sometimes of a proof of concept that you can use to demonstrate the value of such a system. So maybe it's something small. Case in point, my colleague who's an expert in survey design and research deploys and consults, divisional and institutional surveys all the time. And it's hard for her to keep track of every question she's ever asked. So we worked with the Qualtrics API, and she and I devised a way to extract every question that she historically used in Qualtrics. While we'll probably use this system maybe to kind of devise ways to map questions that we've asked to constructs like belonging, we specifically did it just to make her life a little easier. So now when she's creating a new survey and wonders, hey, did I ask this before? She can simply scan a repository of all the questions for possible reuse without having to go into Qualtrics and go into each and every one of those surveys to find out where she asked it. But you'll never know what obstacles you're going to hit until you hit them. So like Adam said, iterate, fix, pivot, change course, but just start with one caveat. We all have a responsibility to safeguard our students, and that means, safeguarding the data that they generate.
So I would agree with what was said before. I'm going to do something I don't usually do, which is in quote Donald Rumsfeld, right? There's the known unknowns and the unknowns for what you're going to do. And I do think you need to try and, so there's going to be problems, right? That you can't anticipate, and you're going to roll things out as you can. I do think starting small and building is great advice, but there are things that you should anticipate would be problems, right? Or potential issues. And so think about who is going to manage this data? How is this process going to continue when specific people have gone, right? And so for us, we're focused on my position is going to be responsible for entering data into the system of record. But what's coming from the departments is manageable for them. When I'm going to be entering it is manageable for my position, so that in the future, whenever that happens, that I'm not in this position, it should still be able to continue, even if someone is less invested in this process than I personally am, because it makes sense with my role and with what's feasible, and that you're not requiring some really super high performer who's going out of their way to make this happen. And then once they leave, it's not happening. Also thinking about things from the perspective of your departments, right? That they are going to want to create new codes and sunset, and they're going to want to change names. And that makes sense because of where their focus is, but that doesn't work for the perspective. And so needing to have some process in terms of like, who is approving the codes? There should be somebody who's like, or however you're including data, right? It doesn't just have to be group codes, but like having some different groups that are looking at this to be approving and saying like, yes, this makes sense. This is information that is stable over time, that it makes sense to put into the system of record, and that we have confidence isn't going to change dramatically, or that you're thinking about. So rather than saying, leadership gets its own code and this other student program gets its own code, well, those might sunset in a couple of years or change focus, but we do know that like leadership development is something that's going to happen over time and regardless. So maybe the code isn't for one specific program that we're tracking, but we're tracking participation in these kinds of events that can be generalized across the division. So thinking about like, what are the things that we need to track across the division? So we've started with student employees in the division because everybody has them, and it makes sense to invest in those individuals and track their success. And then we'll start building it out in different ways, some that will stretch across the division and some that will be very specific to different departments and how they're going to use it. So take extra time to be thoughtful about what you're building so that it can last a long time, right? You need to build a strong foundation to build up off of that. So that would be my advice, to be thoughtful about that.
And I'll piggyback on what everyone said. Start small. And just recognize the fact that most likely you're going to fail at some point, and that's okay. I hope what you've heard so far is we've all kind of approached this in different ways, and it really is based on the current leadership you have at your institutions, what support you get from IR and IT as far as how you're able to actually implement this. But we failed several times, and we realized we've got to start small and expand, and that's okay. I think just accepting that that's okay, because what we want to do is just make sure that we didn't fail again. So we took all those lessons learned and approached it much differently this last time.
Great. Well, now let's transition to some of the questions that came in from our audience members. For the most part, we're going to try to take these chronologically based on the order in which they came in. But I always think it's helpful to start with definitions. And so this is a good question, I think, to get us started. How would you define data lake? And I guess question for Scott, in the back, is your Zoom background, is that a data lake behind you? Very nice.
That's a data fountain.
Data fountain, even better.
I'll take a stab. Well, data lake to be kind of different than, let's say, data warehouse. Data warehouse is very structured data. Data lake, sometimes the data can take the original form that they were in the original source of record. One thing that data lakes usually don't have is they're not considered what's called ACID compliance. Sounds trippy, but means you get with a data lake, you don't get an, let's say, you don't get guarantees of atomicity, consistency, isolation, durability. What that kind of means is you can get instances where something is true over here and something is false over here, and you don't necessarily know why without more stringently going through the data, meaning that you don't get guarantees that things that are supposed to work together always work together, and things that are supposed to fail together always fail together. The also differences is when you set up, let's say, a very structured database like a data warehouse, it's a source of truth, and it's non-mutable. Case in point, anyone that works with anthology engaged, depending upon how your system of record, whether it's Banner, PeopleSoft, or funneling into it, sometimes a student email address in engaged will be off because it was their email address at that time, but their email address changed over time because a new student comes in with an identical first name, last name, so a digit gets appended to it. Or sometimes emails are being reused over time. We had an Adam Smith 10 years ago, we have an Adam Smith now. Adam Smith from 10 years ago doesn't need that email address. The Adam Smith now does need that email address. So those are types of inconsistencies that would be worked out in a data warehouse, but something like a data lake, they may not be worked out.
That's really helpful. This other question, Annie had mentioned a little bit in her response a few moments ago when she was talking about data tied to HIPAA or working with students who attend Pride events, for example. How did you build trust for appropriate data access and use among sensitive areas, such as professionals in student counseling and student health, among other areas?
So for us specifically, and I tried to answer this within another question too, was typing pretty frantically. When it comes to the HIPAA protected data, since most of that's in our health center or within our whole well-being unit, they have their own data team, and then they report aggregate data to me. and I feed data to them. So rather than them feeding data to me, I pass it to them. And we, through an API, send our data over to them into their system, and then they interpret it and provide aggregate information back. So that way it protects that specifically when it comes to HIPAA areas. I will say though, having, because I think the question is also about data stewardship and who owns what data, and needing to set up really good partnerships with that. Our registrar has at times been challenged, a challenging relationship to say, this data is really important, here's why we need it. For example, and yes, at UGA, we recognize we're a little bit behind the times here. We would like to text students, and we are very challenged to text students because some of our folks don't believe that that is appropriate, that should be not directory level information, that we are now attacking them on a whole new level and not just email. But they're not reading email, and they do respond to text messages. And we're not like abusing the system. So we had to do, I'm telling you, this took a full year of convincing people why we needed access to phone numbers. Now I can pull a list of phone numbers anytime, but that doesn't mean I can use them. So to get the approval and of our registrar to say, yes, we accept you having access to this information and utilizing it for this was really important. And yes, it took us a long time of providing case studies of other universities who are already doing this, what kind of parameters we will have for how we will use the data and how won't we use the data, how we will allow students immediately to opt out if they would like, which by the way, our opt-out rate is like a whole 3%. So yeah, it does take thinking through, what do you want, why do you want it, and what are your parameters on it to go to those partners to ask for the data.
The other thing I would recommend, when we were having this conversation at an institutional level, we actually looked to Notre Dame. They kind of flipped data access and governance on its head and made people justify why you shouldn't have access to data, as opposed to why you as an individual should have access to data. And they got rid of the idea of data owners. And so whether or not you were a system manager, you still didn't own that data. That's the university's data that you shepherded. But it really helped us, I think, work better as a university, because nobody had these inherent rights to being able to say no, because that's done as part of the data cleansing and governance effort. When things are protected by a HIPAA or a FERPA or other things, then having people making that decisions, it was more about policy dictating data limitations. And I think it's helped us really work better and have a better common language when we're talking about access and governance.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Adam. Really appreciate that example. Next question from the chat. Could panelists speak to anyone who is combining program participation and survey data, or perhaps working with communication and course portal engagement? I'll paste that question into the chat.
Sure, I can. And that was one of the first things that we started experimenting with early on, pulling all activity data from Anthology Engaged, and then mapping that with student responses to the Qualtrics surveys that we give out. So absolutely, that's something that we work on and we're still developing out, which requires us working with the SB Engaged. We refer to as Stony Brook Engaged API, and also the Qualtrics API, and then getting those and then mapping them on Student ID. So yeah, that's something that we did. We did a kind of just as like a pet like kind of proof of concept. We identified a few key surveys that are tied with some new student programming events, and then we pulled all the events and the card swipes for those, and then we mapped that on to those specific students' responses across maybe 3 or 4 semesters that we gave out throughout the semester, and got it at row level. So this student went to this, went to this, went to this, and they responded this on this question on this survey, this question on this survey, this question on survey, on this survey. So absolutely something that is doable and possible. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this integrated data system in the first place, to be able to make those linkages across a wide range of data. Oh, and I see also communications. Yes, we also used open, popular emails that went out through the, did this student that go to this event and filled this out in these surveys, did they open this email or this email or this email? So we also looked at email open rates by students as well.
So I'll add for us, we are not including any sort of assessment data into our data lake. The reason for that is, we envision our data lake as belonging to the institution. So what I don't want is at some point a faculty member getting a hold of the data that's in our data lake and analyzing our assessment data. So for us, we keep all assessment data out of the data lake. Now, if the assessment data is related to a program, we have the roster, so we can identify when students participated in the program, if they completed the program, et cetera. But any assessment related data we're keeping out of there.
And I see we're coming close to the top of the hour, so this might be our last question to the panelists. Has anyone included or worked with qualitative data with your integrated data system? And if so, how and what might that look like?
I'm going to say yes, but it's going to be a cheating kind of yes, because everything was coded and turned into quantitative data. So we've done portfolios, social media analysis, and some other things, but it all eventually has to be stored. Because the one thing we didn't want was, we don't do free text searching in our data warehouse or our visualizations. And so we didn't go down the route of purely qualitative information unless it could somehow be transformed into quantitative information.
So I would say currently, no, we're not doing that. And thinking about an institution of 47,000 students, that like what's feasible and manageable, I would say that in the future is possible. I'm starting to utilize Qualtrics Text IQ feature, which allows, it kind of builds in a lot of the qualitative analysis to get sentiment analysis or coding or those kinds of things. And so in the future, I could certainly imagine doing what Alyssa was talking about, where I'm not going to put that kind of data in the system of record, but that we can pull data on students and then connect it to survey data outside of the data warehouse or the data lake for insights about who is having what kinds of experiences, and do we need to focus on different populations. And then I think the place for my position where qualitative data would come back more in would then be those kind of student feedback quotes can be used to create either personas or to highlight the message that so if the numbers say this, here are qualitative quotes that help bring that to life and make it real for people, but not other than that.
Well, again, I want to say thank you so much to our panelists and to everyone who took time to attend today's structured conversation. Just a reminder, a recording of today's session will be available online later this week as we upload and prepare those materials. Please do stay in communication. Panelists, if you can share your contact information. I know there's a number of questions that we were unable to address with our time today, but let's keep the conversation going, because that's one of the great benefits of these offerings. Our next structured conversation is scheduled for April 20th. Hope to see you all there. Until then, thank you again. Have a great day.